was like living in a latrine. There's an inescapable aroma at Khe Sanh that nobody could put their finger on. It just smelled like Khe Sanh. It was awful duty.
On March 10th, the New York Times publishes a leaked report that General Westmoreland has asked for 206,000 more troops, a 40% increase in our commitment. And for a war we've been told we're winning. 2 days later, in the icy waters of the New Hampshire primary, the president's political strength will be tested for the first time since the Tet Offensive. The inquisitor, Senator Eugene McCarthy, has been campaigning vigorously all over the state against the war.
Senator Eugene McCarthy in New Hampshire. Our country, right or wrong. When right, to be kept right. When wrong, to be put right. Vote McCarthy, March 12th.
I think almost anybody running against Johnson on any platform, in a one-on-one in the Democratic Party, could have gotten more than 12%, maybe 20%. And with the addition of the war issue, why, you could figure maybe 10% more.
The president's name is not on the ballot, but his campaign machine is urging a write-in vote. McCarthy's campaign has caught the hearts and minds and energy of the young. College students invade New Hampshire by the busload, even getting a shave and a haircut to be clean for Gene. McCarthy does better than even he expected, 42% of the vote to Johnson's 49%.
We were able to claim an absolute victory in terms of delegates and a relative victory in terms of what it had been said we'd get in the way of a popular vote.
This may have been almost as big a shock to Johnson as the Tet Offensive, because this was his world. This is the supreme politician. This is the man who has risen from the hill country of Texas from nothing on his savvy about votes, elections, and people.
Robert Kennedy is still not a candidate, and he will not become a candidate if President Johnson will accept a deal. Kennedy's press secretary was Frank Mankiewicz.
He had made a proposal. He had used Ted Sorensen to go to Clark Clifford, who was then the Secretary of Defense, and in a sense put that proposition forward, that a commission of wise men might perhaps study the situation, would come up with recommendations, the president would abide by them, and if the president would agree to do that, then Senator Kennedy would not run.
So I went immediately to President Johnson, repeated in detail what Ted Sorensen had said to me, and President Johnson summarily said, not acceptable. Just go tell Sorensen right away, I want no part of it. Let him do anything he chooses to do.
I am announcing today my candidacy for the presidency of the United States. I do not run for the presidency merely to oppose any man, but to propose new policies.
President Johnson does decide to consult with wise men about the war, wise men of his own choosing.
President Johnson had a number of outside advisors, people who had served in previous administrations, who had been troubleshooters, who had been military people.
People like former Secretary of State Dean Acheson, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Maxwell Taylor. Nearly 5 months earlier at the White House, the wise men, nearly all hawks, had supported the president's Vietnam policy. Now, the birds were not all of a feather.
And I briefed on the political diplomatic situation. I remember a few things about the briefing. For example, I remember at one stage very clearly Clark Clifford saying to me, did I think that a military solution was feasible? And my answer was that in the circumstances and under the restrictions that were imposed, that I didn't think that was foreseeable in any foreseeable period of time. And I recommended very flatly and directly that we go for a bombing halt and a negotiation.
He invited them back, spent afternoon and part of a morning with them, and was shocked to find out that almost everyone had changed his mind.
Come back to the last weekend in March of 1968, when Lyndon Johnson takes a good look at his cards and folds his hand.
Our world continues. Winds of change in the winter of '68.
Welcome back to March 1968. A presidency shaped by and haunted by television is about to reach a fitting climax. Fitting because it will take place on television. It is the last weekend in March. President Lyndon Johnson has said he will speak to the nation on Sunday night. He plans to announce he is willing, once again, to stop bombing North Vietnam as an incentive to peace. It is not all he will announce. Later, Johnson would say that doing what's right isn't the problem. It's knowing what's right.
Sitting here resting my bones, and this loneliness won't leave me alone.
In late March of '68, Lyndon Johnson was looking for assurance and finding doubt. His approval rating in the Gallup poll had fallen to its lowest ebb. The war had put many of his plans for the Great Society on hold. And trusted old allies like Martin Luther King told him he was wrong.
I have become deeply disenchanted with President Johnson. I feel that he is so emotionally involved in the war in Vietnam and so concerned about saving face more than achieving peace.
With Bobby Kennedy now in the presidential race, Johnson knew he was up against not just a candidate, but Camelot.
What he was looking at, of course, was that Senator Kennedy was going to beat him for the nomination, and that he would wind up then in history as a sort of a between two bookends, each one of which a Kennedy.
Lyndon Johnson was exhausted. Secretary of State Dean Rusk.
Except for the men and women who carried the battle out there and their families, no one in this country agonized over Vietnam more than did Lyndon Johnson. We could never stop him from getting up at 4:30 or 5 in the morning to go down to the operations room to check on the casualties from Vietnam. Every one of those took a little piece out of him.
On the day before his Vietnam speech, Johnson worked with the man who wrote it, Harry McPherson.
He said, oh, you can, that's all right. You don't have to worry about the length. I think I'm going to have an ending of my own. And he walked on out of the room, and I turned around to Clifford and said, is he going to say sayonara? Goodbye? Clifford looked at me as if I were an idiot.
On television's Hollywood Palace, the night before the president made his speech, Jimmy Durante sang prophetically about Old Man Time.
Old man Time, he's so mean, meanest man you ever see. He gives you youth and he steals it away.
Sunday, March 31st, Washington, D.C.
And they took very heavy, make it be a they there.
With a crude videotape recorder, Lyndon Johnson rehearses what will be his most famous speech.
His secretary and I sat there with him and made little changes in what he was doing. I don't know any other speech that he ever rehearsed to this extent. Sometimes he went over them, but this one had to be perfect.
Johnson called me and said, what do you think about the speech? A peculiar question since I'd been doing nothing else for 2 months. So I think it's okay. I'm glad it's coming out the way it did. And he said, I've got my own ending I'm putting on. I said, so I've heard. He said, do you know what's in it? I said, I'm afraid I do. And I'm really sorry. And he said, well, okay, thanks, partner.
And I can remember that Sunday evening sitting down from the television set and cross-legged on my rug, and I watched, and the speech went on just as I expected it.
Now the President of the United States.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. Tonight I want to speak to you of peace in Vietnam and Southeast Asia. Tonight, I renew the offer I made last August to stop the bombardment of North Vietnam.
When the speech ended, or should have ended, he said, and then I have something else to add, and instantly, without any other word, I knew precisely what was coming, that he was going to do it.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
The Johnson presidency. In a way, it has become another casualty of Vietnam.